Hiya, guys. Hi, Fiona.
Hi.
Director and founder of the Daniel Spargo-Mabbs Foundation, which is a drug and alcohol education charity set up in 2014 in response to her 16-year-old son's death. Her book for parents on young people and drugs and decisions, I Wish I'd Known, was published this year. And she works with education on strategic and practical levels, nationally and locally, and specialises in working with parents and families. So, hi. I love your background. I love your guitar. Who plays the guitar?
Oh, I'm sitting in Dan's bedroom, actually.
Okay.
Dan's bedroom. But I have kind of manufactured a background that it's not all Guns N' Roses, but I have kept a more tasteful guitar. There are other guitars which are. Anyway. But Dan's bedroom is Foundation HQ. We have got an office as well, but this is my home office.
Yes, it looks nice and comfortable. I'm just sitting by a bare wall and a fish tank, which is over there, because everything else looks a bit kind of crazy. Anyway, let's talk about why being confident to talk about drugs with our young people and our kids is very important.
It's really important, and one of the reasons why it's really important is that young people say that their parents are the first place they would go for useful information about drugs. As the government carries out a survey of schools in England, there are the survey in Scotland as well, different one in Wales. But one of the questions they ask 11 to 15-year-olds lots of questions about smoking, drinking, and drugs. And one of them, the question they ask is, where would you go for useful information about drugs? And well top of that list is parents for both alcohol and drugs, which always surprises parents when we tell them that, because they always think it'll be their friends, and then maybe the internet. But actually, in terms of the useful information, parents are where it's at, and as parents, we are the most important. Well, as you know, you've just got your cardigan out because your dad told you to. I mean, they may not let on in their teens quite what a significant influence you have as a parent, but you really, really do. And so those conversations, and making those conversations into something that's really as comfortable as possible, and something that you can both come back to as and when you need to, and even when you don't need to, just having that as something that's an open conversation in your family is really, really important. And it's also important because it's really difficult for young people to avoid coming across drugs now, whether it's in person or on social media. Young people's exposure to drugs and social media is a growing thing. We could talk for half an hour about that, but it's something for parents really to be aware of. And certainly by the time they get through to the end of their schooling, at the end of their formal education, when they're around 18, the vast majority will have been in a situation where they've had to make a decision. The majority will have said no, but some will have said yes, and the number that have said yes has also been growing. So it's an issue that parents need to be mindful of. It's not something their children will be able to avoid, and so it's not something that we should be looking to avoid as parents either, because as you know, as everybody knows really, that, well, and as I know more than most, there can be very significant risks involved. Mostly there aren't. I mean, there are always risks involved. Mostly, I mean, I always feel I have to kind of do a disclaimer. I am unusual, thank goodness. I'm every parent's worst nightmare, and I'm the worst case scenario. And thankfully, it doesn't usually go quite so badly wrong. But there is the potential for all sorts of different risks to young people, and those conversations with parents, but also that whole family dynamic, that the value set that you have, the way that you negotiate and clarify and set boundaries, and the whole kind of those bonds and the connections, the connectedness between parents and children can be so incredibly protective against all the risks, so many risks and issues that they face in their lives. So parents, absolutely vital, really, really important job. Most wonderful job in the entire universe. Most difficult job in the entire universe.
It is indeed, isn't it? So how do parents, because some parents will feel they know quite a lot, And then some parents will think they've never touched it, they've never known anybody, they don't know very much at all. So where's a good place to start?
Buy my book.
Of course, yes.
Well, and every penny goes to our charity, so it's all in a good cause.
Oh.
But I mean, really, that's it is. I called it I Wish I'd Known because it is everything I wish I'd known, and everything that I've learned over the last 7 years since Dan died. I mean, my background was in education, so I knew quite a lot about, but working with adults primarily, but working quite broadly across education for local authority. I was working primarily with parents actually in vulnerable families where they had limited skills in English and maths, their children were underachieving, so family learning kind of it aims to break that cycle of underachievement, kind of working quite closely together. So working with parents is that's my professional background, but I also had to learn all the drug stuff, and I didn't come at it thinking that I knew nothing. Long story really, but within our extended family there's someone who's really struggled with addiction for many years, very close to us, and her little boy lived with us for 5 years. So I didn't feel that I was ignorant, certainly about that kind of side of things. Tim, my husband, and I, we'd done a 6-week course for parents about how to protect your children from the risks of drugs, which of course they said you can't entirely do. But that was when the boys were a bit younger. So I didn't feel that I was as ill-equipped as I might be, but I just didn't know enough. I didn't know quite how close these things were to our door, or quite what a range of substances are now available. And I think even as a parent, if you think you know a lot, or you did stuff when you were younger, the landscape is really very different, and the risks shift actually all the time. So there are some really useful places to go. I mean, we've got a lot of resources and information for parents on our website, but that also signposts them to other websites. So Talk to Frank is the government site. That's England run that, and that's a really useful starting point. Well, and actually there's probably pretty much most of what you need to know is there. They've got an A to Z of drugs, which it's got quite comprehensive information about the effects and the risks and what the law says, and there's also an area on there for parents, and there's in terms of alcohol, Drink Aware has got an area for parents. The Alcohol Education Trust is a really great charity, and they've got a parents area as well, and they do a parents newsletter. So there are places you could go. I mean, as a parent, you can't possibly know all of these things and keep yourself up to date from scratch, but if there are places you know to go, then and keep dipping in. And also our social media. I mean, I don't know if people do social media stuff, but we use Facebook more heavily than anything else because it kind of fits with our parent demographic. There are lots of parents do. Really got to get the hang of it. And we do tweet as well, but for Facebook is we use quite a lot as kind of front line of information and advice, and things that come up on. I just saw a nice message in the chat, thank you. Things that oh, it's completely lost my thread now. What was I saying? Sorry. Thank you.
About social media.
Social media. Yes, sorry. So Facebook. So we put stuff on there. I do this news trawl every day. I get all these Google alerts and a news digest and things. So that anything that's relevant to young people and parents and drugs and alcohol, I'll put there.
So can I ask you a few questions? So my parents have got some I don't know how you can answer some of them. let me ask you a nice question first. So how do you explain that medical and prescribed drugs can be good as well as bad? Because they kind of see it black and white, don't they? But there's
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good point. I mean, in fact, talking about medicines is a really good way into talking about the risks of all drugs, because a lot of the risks are the same. You can overdose on most things. That nothing just makes one thing better. It also risks harming something else. Even something like Calpol is paracetamol that can risk damaging your liver if you have too much, as well as making your headache better or your toothache better, whatever it is. So that's a really useful way into talking about the risks. But there are risks. So there is no such thing as a risk-free drug, which is something that we often say at workshops. And we do talk about medicines in the context of the risks of legal drugs, because those risks are managed so carefully. It's not that they're risk-free, but those risks are managed incredibly carefully. And actually, COVID has given us a really recent good example of how that balance between risk and benefit. So, you know, the risks that were being seen through the vaccine program will have been weighed against the benefits of to public health, and actually you're likely to get more poorly from getting COVID than from the possible complications that there can be, but also how long it takes to get a new medication approved, because those risks have to be weighed up, and so they are really, really carefully managed. You know, they're made under license. You know exactly what's in them, how much. You know, you're given really clear guidance on how you should take them, and something that's only prescribed means that those risks are that much higher than something you'd get over the counter in the supermarket, and they're prescribed to somebody who a medically trained person has decided needs that medication. So for whatever reason, for whatever medical condition they've got, that medicine will help them more than harm them. But for somebody that hasn't got that medical condition, they're likely to do harm and not the good, because they don't need that benefit. So prescription medication is absolutely, definitely not risk-free. And if it's being taken by somebody for whom it hasn't been prescribed, then the risks are that much greater as well. And it's just young people can tend to think that it therefore means it's safer. And there's also a concern about drugs which can be used by some young people recreationally that are seen as prescription medication, like, for example, Xanax, which is a benzodiazepine, like Valium and diazepam and so on, and gained a lot of popularity, particularly through music, and particularly rap and grime and things. But it's if you're getting that in the UK, it's not prescribed in the UK, not on the NHS. So it's very, very, very unlikely that somehow someone's nicked a load of stuff off the back of a pharmaceutical company lorry or anything. You know, it would have been made in a pill press in the same way that ecstasy pills will have been, or any other pills that have been produced through a very messy, careless process. And the contents will be who knows what. So yeah, it's a good way into a conversation, and a really good way of focusing on the fact that these risks are managed carefully for this reason. But also with illegal drugs, nobody's managing those risks. They're not made in a nice clean lab. Nobody's checking what's in them or how much. Nobody's checking that anybody taking them knows that they're not going to come to more harm than good. And very often the substances that are in them are in themselves potentially very risky. You know, some of them are used medicinally as well, like ketamine or nitrous oxide. They're used as medicines, but they're used in a very controlled and managed way.
And you know that when you get it one day, the next week it'll be the same strength and same everything.
Absolutely. But even then with medicines, you know, especially when they're very strong medicines, people that if anybody's worked in the medical profession at all, if you're prescribing medication for people, the more risky it is, the more complicated calculations have to be made in terms of body weight and looking at other medication they might be on, or medical history, or, you know, other potential complications that could be from you know, possibly mental health, or, you know, other risks that there could be to that individual.
Yeah, you change one thing and then it impacts it, but you don't think it will.
Yes, yeah.
So I've got a question from a dad. I've got one question from a dad, because I can't ignore. After my dad said to me, I said, all right then, Dad, you know, whatever. This is not my dad. This is, he said, how can you talk to your teenager about alcohol and help them know the effects, about what the negative effects, without them actually drinking alcohol to feel what it feels like?
That's a really good question. And alcohol's great in the sense that there's lots and lots of examples around us all the time that you can talk about. So there's often stuff on a film or in a drama, or you might see something around and about, or there might have been an experience or something that they've seen at a family party or something, you know. But there are examples you can use. I mean, films and dramas and comedies and things are quite often a useful prompt for a conversation anyway. So that could be quite a useful kind of way in, and if that's something that they've seen. It's useful to talk about the way that psychoactive substances work on the brain, because alcohol is a drug, it's a psychoactive substance, it's incredibly addictive and has an awful lot of very, very harmful effects in the both short and long term. I mean, it's one of the worst. No, it's not one of the worst. They're all bad.
Costs the NHS a lot of money, doesn't it?
Absolutely it does, yeah, but in the short term as well, the harm can be incredibly significant. I mean, it could be fatal as alcohol poisoning, you know, or get run over by a bus. But talking about the way that substances act on the brain, which is basically they interfere, they mess with our head basically, which is kind of why people take them really. But they interfere with all those communication messages that are going around our brains all the time. So all the neurons that are sending out neurotransmitters to other neurons and telling our brain what to do and think and feel, and our whole, and then round our entire body. Drugs change that messaging, so they might speed that up, they might slow it down, they might just kind of alter what it does. And alcohol slows all of that down, so it slows down your reaction time, it slows down thinking, it slows down it slows down your kind of ability to make good judgments and decisions, and even kind of that hand-eye coordination thing, you know, how far away is that the edge of the precipice really, and your balance, you know, everything that you'd normally have to just kind of go about your life safely, it just is just functioning that much slower, more slowly. And so talking about the effects kind of I mean, it depends on your child and what age they are and kind of what they're into, but it's making your brain communicate with itself more slowly and making everything happen more slowly. And another thing you can do is think through scenarios. So I mean, if you've kind of got that sense of, look, that's how it's, you know, if you're saying something, you've got something on a film and someone's got really drunk and they've fallen over, or they've made a very bad decision about something or whatever, you could kind of come up with scenarios together, you know. So what would happen if, just imagine if, okay, they fell over and they just fell off the sofa, but imagine if they were with their friends and they were by a river, or imagine if, you know, or imagine if there were people around that actually weren't good people, that might, if you passed out somewhere, what kind of harms could come to you if that sort of thing happens? Or, you know, they've acted out of character doing that, they've got in a fight with somebody, what could happen if, you know, if that person wasn't their best mate, if it was a stranger in the street, or even if it wasn't a stranger in the street, if it was their best mate, you know, you can think through that, what would happen if stuff. That's always quite good food for conversations, and it also keeps it distanced as well. It's quite good not to be talking about kind of, so if you did this or if you did that, you know, it keeps it at a distance. It's probably worth mentioning as well, sorry, I only do long answers, I hope you know, sorry, I've only got 10 minutes left, so you have to pick your juiciest question. There's a really good one about cannabis you were going to ask me as well, which I'll answer.
Okay.
It's worth just pointing out that the Chief Medical Officer's advice for all 4 UK nations is that under 15s really shouldn't touch alcohol. There's too much going on in their brains and their bodies and their bones, their hormones. Also, the earlier you have that first drink, the more likely statistically you are to develop problems with alcohol as you get older. It's not an inevitability, but it's statistically you increase that likelihood. So it's just worth keeping in mind as parents, because it's not always easy for parents to know how to, when do you introduce, how do you do that, and because it's legal, it's cool.
I like the idea of talking through scenarios, because very often drugs and alcohol look safe, they're having so much fun, they're able to express themselves and do so much stuff, but actually if you talk through the end of a scenario, then there is always a consequence, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let me ask you the question then about, let me see. So I've got one here that says, my son says it's normal for teenagers to smoke cannabis. Everybody does it. What's the big deal?
You know, we get this all the time, and that's the message. I know it's really difficult for parents because it's been so normalized, and also it's such a confusing time for young people to make sense of cannabis as something that's risky, because it's in so many, I mean, because it's legal in increasing numbers of parts. I just picked up a piece of news that Switzerland's going to make cannabis legal for recreational use. I haven't read it properly, so please forgive me if I'm wrong. But it, you know, 16 US states, Canada, Uruguay, other countries talking about it, and other countries with more lenient legislation as well. And it's, so that in itself, so you can see stuff in films and dramas where people are smoking weed perfectly legally. It's on all sorts of different media, in music and so on. there's all the conversation about medicinal cannabis, again, going back to that prescription medication thing, because for a lot of young people, that means if it's used as medicine, surely it's good for you. That equivalent. Then CBD is just everywhere. CBD is a cannabis product, but it's not illegal because it's not the bit that gives you the high. But there's kind of CBD in virtually everything at the moment, and all sorts of kind of health claims being made for it, and lots of really interesting research being done. So it's a really confusing time. Plus, in the bit of South London that I live in, you can't walk very far without smelling it. So there's a sense that it is around everywhere. But actually, and I don't know if the person that asked that question is here, or if you've got a pen and paper, because I've some data. A lot of young people are smoking weed, but vast majority of young people aren't. So everybody isn't doing it. So if you've got a pen and paper, the government data, that school survey data, 15-year-olds, 23% of 15-year-olds have tried weed at least once. Only 10% in the last month, which is a question around kind of how likely is it to be a regular thing. But even with the 23% that had tried weed at least once, that means that 77% haven't. So that's more than 3/4 haven't tried weed by the age of 15. And then when you look at older teenagers, 16 to 24-year-olds, they ask questions slightly differently. 19% had smoked cannabis in the last year. So again, that means, I mean, it's 1 in 5, which that's still quite an awful lot, but it's still the vast majority aren't. And that it's really important to, this social norms thing is so powerful, and a lot of young people really overestimate how much their peers are doing something. And there was some research that came out just in the summer that showed that actually peer perception of peer behaviour in terms of drugs and alcohol was the strongest factor in their own decision making about drugs and alcohol. The more likely they are to think that everyone's doing it, the more likely they are. And we're all like that, to be honest, aren't we? You can see it with face masks on public transport. You know, it's kind of got fewer and fewer and fewer people are actually wearing a face mask now. And then the whole conversation about the specific risks from cannabis, especially the fact that it's just got so incredibly strong. And specific risks to adolescents, it's the very worst time of your life to be smoking cannabis because of the really critical period of change that your brain is going through.
Absolutely.
It's so incredibly strong. You're so much more likely to develop an addiction, 3 times more likely to develop depression and anxiety than people that don't smoke cannabis, twice as likely to have a psychotic experience. More young people are in drug and alcohol treatment for cannabis. 89% of people, young people, teenagers that are in treatment are there for cannabis, more than anything else put together. The next biggest is alcohol. So there are it's not risk-free and it's not normal.
It's and also like attracts like, so it's actually a foster mum, and actually her boy does hang around the group of young people. They all smoke, but then I think in other groups of friends there's nobody that smokes, so it's just really tricky.
We talk about the I mean, I guess in terms of holding on to what's right for you and what you know is going to keep you safe. We talk about the frog in the boiling water thing, you know, where you've got a frog and you put it in a pan of boiling water and it'll jump straight out, but you've got a frog and you put it in a pan of cold water and bring it slowly to the boil, and how
I won't know.
Things can change around you without you maybe realizing. In a friendship group, you can kind of drift into a friendship group a little bit, who can drift into certain behaviors and maybe end up somewhere that you'd never jumped into, but just by those little steps. And it's just being really vigilant, I think, about the behavior of people around you and knowing what's right for you and having the confidence to kind of hold on to that, and having that bigger picture as well. Okay, this group, it's normal for this group, but it's not normal across my whole year group. You know, most people aren't doing whatever it is.
Which is great, because that was one of the other questions, is my son doesn't have the confidence to say no to his friends. And it is self-awareness and that whole, what you've just been saying, it's very, if it happens slowly, you don't realise.
No, and peer pressure can be someone going, go on. But more often than not, it's just that kind of things shifting, or a fear of missing out, and with it's again because of this neurological change that's going on. It's a time of our lives where we've just got this acute sensitivity to social approval and disapproval, and so managing that influence is really hard. But there are lots of strategies, kind of generic strategies that you can work through. But in terms of feeling, you know, like anything you can do to build self-confidence and problem-solving skills and self-esteem, they can plan ahead. We're programmed as human beings psychologically to respect a reason. If someone's got a reason and they stick to their gun, even if it's a really rubbish reason, they can plan ahead. You know, you can say, okay, what is my reason going to be? And if it's kind of a bigger reason than just I've got to get up really early tomorrow, because that's only going to do on the odd occasion, it can't be always that, you know. But so then that can get you out of situation. Sometimes if you know there's a group or a situation where you might end up getting caught up in something or feeling pressured or tempted, because that can be a little bit blurry as well, because things can look like fun, or you can be curious about what it's going to feel like. And sometimes it's just best not to be there. You know, if you know that that's something you don't really want to do, it's not something you're comfortable with, then make an excuse, just get out of it, just don't be there. And in that moment of decision, have a few stalling tactics up your sleeve. It's harder to access that sensible bit of your brain when you're a teenager, the bit that would go, hold on a minute, I didn't think that's such a good idea. That prefrontal cortex, you've got to wait till your mid-20s really before
or 30, yeah.
Well, yes, or 54. No, but seriously, I mean, it is harder. And also the other thing that's worth keeping in mind, and a useful question to keep in mind, is would I do this if I was on my own? Because all the research that's been done about teenage risk taking shows that left to their own devices, the average teenager, generally speaking, is pretty good at weighing up risk and isn't that far out from the average adult. But the big difference is as soon as you put other teenagers there. With adults, if you put other adults around, they're more likely to behave more sensibly. This is in a driving simulator. But with teenagers, their accident rate will shoot up. So, but if you can have that question niggling away in your head, going, okay, just take a moment. If I was on my own, is this something I'd be choosing to do right now? And if it isn't, then don't do it. And have confidence that the friends that are worth keeping are the ones that will respect you. And remember that everyone around you has also got brains that aren't wired up properly yet. They're going through this process of change. They're acutely self-conscious. They're not managing risk well. They're not thinking things through. They're not the best people whose behaviour you should be following. So, yeah, sorry, I've run out of my half hour.
No, that's good. Thank you very much. Thank you. You've covered loads of ground and actually quite a number of the questions. So thank you, Fiona. I really appreciate your time and sharing and everything. And I love that you talked at a pace because you just crammed in so much.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I do.
No, that's good. That's good. I like that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I will catch up with you another time. But thank you.